This is Harsh Rules, I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Fire in the Lake. Fire in the Lake, the second edition, was released in 2018 by GMT Games and designed by Mark Herman and Volko Ruhnke. The first edition was released in 2014. This game supports up to 4 players and takes about 3 hours to play. Before we begin this episode, I'd like to recognize the Harsh Rules Patreon supporters that help make content like this possible. If you'd like to support the channel, head over to patreon.com/harshrules to learn more. And once again, thank you for your support. I would also like to take a moment for a special thanks to our super supporter, Rob B., also known as Messin' Up Rules over on Board Game Geek. Rob graciously sent me a copy of Fire in the Lake for this breakdown series. Fire in the Lake's sequence of play is driven by event cards. During the game's setup, a period-specific deck is prepared for the scenario being played. Then the first 2 cards are turned over to display for the players. The first card is the active card in play for the current turn. The next card is a preview of the upcoming turn. The top of an event card shows a row of each faction's symbols and establishes the order of play for that turn. Following the order of play, up to 2 factions will take a turn per card. The first faction will then choose either to move their colored cylinder onto the flowchart or pass for the turn. If a faction passes, they move their cylinder to the pass space at the bottom of the eligible factions box and collects resources. They will become eligible to play again on the next turn. The first faction that moves onto the flowchart has 3 options. Each player has a reference card that details their operations and special activities that they can play. The first flowchart space only allows the first faction to play an operation, the second space an operation paired with a special activity, and with the third space, the faction may play an event on the card in play. Card events have 2 options. The non-shaded events often favor the counter-insurgent factions, and the shaded events the insurgent factions. Once the faction decides, they place their cylinder on that space and complete the game action they selected. The second faction that follows onto the flowchart is then forced to take the next space. Some of these spaces only offer limited operations, which means they can only be conducted in one space on the game board. Welcome back to the Harsh Rules breakdown for Fire in the Lake. In this episode, we're going to begin learning basic operations. The game includes foldouts that displays the operations and special activities for each faction. Players will need to get familiar with these foldouts as they contain the rules essential for conducting game actions. With that said, Fire in the Lake is famous for its asymmetrical gameplay, which means each faction has actions that may differ from their opponents and even their ally. While factions have a lot of overlap in their game actions, there is still a lot of variations to remember amongst all 4, which can be quite daunting. To make the game easier to learn, the designers have recommended a staged approach. First, play through the game using only the operations. Then in the next game, add in special activities, and finally, work in the events from the cards. This will allow players to get acclimated to the fundamentals and gradually introduce the remaining game actions when they're ready. With that in mind, I'm going to structure the next episodes to accommodate this learning style. Therefore, we will first cover operations, then special activities, and so on. And now that we have our learning plan in place, let's get started. A faction executing an operation chooses one of the 4 operations listed on its faction sheet and selects the map spaces to conduct them in. The player can use a white pawn to indicate the spaces where the operation will take place. Operations usually cost resources for each space involved. Players will deduct this cost by updating their faction's resource marker on the number track. Remember, the US faction shares resources with the ARVN faction and uses their gold resource marker. However, the US player is limited to spending resources that are above the Econ marker. Only the ARVN player may spend resources below the Recon marker number. When conducting an operation, the executing faction chooses the order of the spaces in which they will be resolved, the game pieces to be targeted or affected, and the friendly pieces to be placed, replaced, or moved. An operation may target both enemies or just one. It's up to the faction executing the operation. Fire in the Lake uses several different types of game pieces. For the sake of brevity, I may reference these game pieces by their shape, such as hexagonals, cubes, and discs. While they may have unique names to support the game's theme, their game function is determined by their shape. Let's walk through each of these game piece types to learn more about them. First up, we have cubes, which represent troops and police. Troops are professional armed forces. Police represent both urban police and rural militias, such as regional forces and popular forces. The hexagonal game pieces are guerrillas for the insurgents and special forces for the counterinsurgents. Insurgent guerrillas are unique in that they can go underground, which essentially means they can hide from their opponents. This is indicated by placing the star end of the game piece face down. While in this hidden state, they typically cannot be attacked. They first must be revealed, or in game terminology, activated, to be engaged in combat. There are several game actions that can reveal them. Some actions can be conducted by the opponent to find and activate them. At other times, the owning player's actions with them will come at the additional cost of revealing and activating them. For example, conducting terror operations or moving into high-traffic spaces on the board. Hexagonal game pieces for the counterinsurgent factions, the US and ARVN, function differently. Their activation feature is often linked to special activities that we will cover in a subsequent episode. Then there are bases. Bases represent command, training, and supply facilities as well as political administration. From a gameplay perspective, insurgent bases count for victory points. And once a base is in place, it typically increases the amount of hexagonal and cube game pieces that can be added to the space it occupies. At the beginning of specific scenarios, and through the use of certain cards, insurgent bases may be upgraded to tunneled bases. These are much harder to remove than a regular base. In most situations, game pieces have a required removal priority when suffering casualties. First, cubes are removed, then hexagonals, and finally, bases. This requirement creates an additional defensive measure for insurgent forces, the VC and NVA, as a base cannot be eliminated unless all previous game piece types have been removed. What makes this challenging is underground insurgent guerrillas must first be revealed and activated before they're eliminated, opening an opportunity to target and destroy an insurgent base. Tunnels further hide and protect bases from discovery and removal. A tunnel must be removed first before targeting the base. A tunnel marker must be removed first before targeting the base. Finding an insurgent base in a tunnel requires a single die result of 4 through 6, which can make rooting out insurgent forces pretty challenging. And now with this overview completed, we're ready to get into the nuts and bolts of each faction's operations. Operations are most similar between factions on the same side of the conflict. Therefore, let's first discuss the counterinsurgent faction's train operation, which allows them to add game pieces to the map. At first glance, these two train panels look very similar, but there are distinct differences between the two factions. For this first panel, I'm going to break every line down to give you an understanding of the layout and how they function. Both of these operations are named train. The specific rules for this operation can be found in the 3.2.1 section of the rulebook. The ARVN version of train can be paired with the transport special activity or the govern special activity. The US version of the train operation can be paired with any special activity. The purpose of train is different for each faction. With the ARVN train, the purpose is to augment ARVN forces and support. For the US, it's to build local forces, support, and cut patronage. The main difference here is cut patronage with the US version of train, which we'll see in just a moment. Train can only be conducted in the following location types. For the ARVN version of train, this is cities or provinces without NVA control. For the US version of train, these are cities or provinces with US pieces. So ARVN train can be conducted in any city or province that is either neutral or has coin control. US train is a little broader. As long as they have US pieces in the city or province, they can conduct a train operation there. The cost is 3 resources per space where ARVN game pieces are placed. For the US player, if they do not place ARVN game pieces, there is no cost. Therefore, the US faction only pays 3 resources per space when they place ARVN game pieces there. Remember that the US and ARVN are sharing the same resources. The procedure section of each panel gets really cramped with information, so let's break it down one piece at a time. First, let's parse out the core procedure of the train operation. For the ARVN train procedure, if the space is a city or the space contains a US or ARVN base, place 1 to 2 rangers or up to 6 ARVN cubes. The US procedure is a little less restrictive. They may place 1 to 2 irregulars, or if there's a US base in the space, 1 to 2 rangers, or up to 6 ARVN cubes. Pay close attention to the wording on these panels. You'll notice that the US train operation, when a US base is present in the space, they may place ARVN game pieces. Remember that rangers are the ARVN hexagonal game pieces, and irregulars are the US hexagonal game pieces. Next, we have what I call bonus actions embedded in the procedure. On the ARVN train panel, the bonus procedure states, in one space a training operation was conducted. The player may trade 3 ARVN cubes for 1 ARVN base from their available box. Or, if there are ARVN cubes in the space with coin control, they may pacify the space by 1 to 2 levels. On the US train operation panel, the bonus action text states, in one coin-controlled training space, pay to pacify the space by 1 to 2 levels, or, if Saigon, remove 3 patronage points and add them to ARVN resources. Here we see the point of contention between these two allies. ARVN is trying to skim off aid to support their regime, but if the US conducts a training operation in Saigon, they can redirect patronage back to the ARVN resource counter. Essentially redirect those funds back to what they were originally intended for. This will cost the ARVN player victory points they need to win the game. Now, let's discuss how PACIFY works. PACIFY is used to remove any terror markers placed by insurgent factions with their terror operations. In a city or province, removing terror will shift influence up to 2 levels towards active support. For the ARVN faction, PACIFY requires the space to be under coin control and contain both troops and police. The US faction's PACIFY action differs from pacification during the support step of the coup phase as follows. They do not need troops and police, only a US game piece and coin control. Each PACIFY action costs 3 ARVN resources per terror marker removed and level shifted. This is true even if the US faction did not pay for their train operation. The insurgent operation for placing game pieces is called rally. For the NVA, the purpose of rally is to augment friendly forces and upgrade the trail. For the VC, the purpose is to augment or recover friendly forces. A rally operation may be conducted in any provinces or cities without support. The cost is 1 resource per space. The NVA may also pay 2 resources to improve the trail. The procedure section on these panels are also really packed with information. So let's break it down a piece at a time, first focusing on the core procedures. There are several options for this one. The executing faction can place 1 guerrilla from their available box into the selected space. Or they may replace 2 of their guerrillas in the selected space with a base from their faction. Now, if the selected space for rally already has a base from that faction, if it's the NVA and it's their base, they may place guerrillas up to the sum of the trail value plus the number of bases in that space. If it's the VC and it's their base, they may place guerrillas up to the sum of the space's population value plus the number of bases in the space. Or they may flip all guerrillas in that space to underground status. After the core procedure has been completed, there are some bonus actions that each faction can undertake. The NVA faction may pay 2 resources to upgrade the trail by 1 level. For the VC, if they have the cadre's capability in play, they may pay to agitate. Capabilities are triggered by specific card events. Agitation is a function that is usually employed by the VC in a step of the coup phase. We will look at card capabilities and the coup phase in a subsequent episode of this series. Let's walk through the insurgent faction's movement operation called March. March may be paired with any special activity. However, March may not be conducted during a monsoon. Remember that a monsoon occurs on the card just before the coup card. By conducting a march operation, an insurgent faction may move any of its guerrillas and troops in one space into an adjacent space. Pieces moving from one space to another move as a single group. It costs 1 resource to move game pieces onto a province or a city space, but it costs no resources to move onto a line of communication space. The procedure for march is consistent amongst the insurgent factions. Once any respective NVA troops and NVA or VC guerrillas move into adjacent spaces, and that space is either a line of communication or a province or city that supports the Republic of South Vietnam, and if the moving pieces plus any US or ARVN cubes and special forces exceed 3, activate all of the guerrillas. Basically, lines of communication are high traffic areas where guerrillas will be noticed and reported. The same is true of province or city spaces with a high number of game pieces on both sides. If the total number of game pieces exceed 3, then the guerrillas are noticed and their location is reported, activating them. Let's look at a quick example. 2 underground VC guerrillas conduct a march operation from the Parrot's Beak into Kiang Phong, where there are 2 ARVN police cubes and the space supports the Republic of South Vietnam. The 4 total game pieces in the space exceeds the visibility threshold of 3 game pieces. Therefore, the ARVN identify the guerrilla's position and they are activated, in other words, revealed. The 2 VC guerrillas are flipped over to their activated side, the one with the star. The NVA have an additional ability to their march operation. The marching NVA guerrillas and troops, not VC, may continue moving into additional spaces, paying once only for each added destination if the previous destination space was in Laos or Cambodia. The trail value is above 0 and the march is not a limited operation. Also, if the trail value equals 4, NVA march into or out of individual Laos or Cambodia spaces with no cost. Next, let's look at the way that counterinsurgent forces move their game pieces. Notice that their operations differ greatly from the insurgent factions, is that they're often paired with other actions. A patrol operation protects lines of communication by moving troops or police onto them and finding and removing insurgents there. If the ARVN faction is conducting the patrol operation, pay 3 resources total, not per space. If the US faction, the cost is 0. The procedure for a patrol operation is as follows. The counterinsurgent faction may move any number of cubes from a space into an adjacent line of communication or a city, and may continue entering adjacent cities and lines of communication until either they choose to stop or enter a space with any NVA or VC pieces. Then, in any line of communication space, this is whether or not a cube just moved there, activate 1 enemy guerrilla for each counterinsurgent faction's cubes. Then, if desired, the executing faction may conduct an assault operation in 1 line of communication at no added cost. If patrol is conducted as a limited operation, the assault must be in the destination line of communication. As for assault operations, we will cover those momentarily. Sweep operations allow counterinsurgent factions to move troops into a province or city and find the enemy. Sweep operations are not allowed during a monsoon, which is the card played right before a coup card. A sweep operation may not be conducted at all on the North Vietnam space. For the ARVN faction, the cost to conduct a sweep operation is 3 resources per space selected. The US faction may conduct sweep operations at no cost. And the procedure for a sweep operation is as follows. First, the executing faction may move any adjacent troops into the selected spaces. In addition, each group of troops may first move onto an adjacent line of communication that is free of NVA or VC, and then into an adjacent space. Any troops that move must reach spaces paid for as destinations. Then, in each selected space, activate 1 enemy guerrilla for each cube or special forces in that space. In jungle spaces, activate only 1 enemy guerrilla for every 2 cubes or special forces. Round odd totals down. For example, the ARVN faction selects Quang Duc for a sweep and places a white pawn on the space. The line of communication to Quang Duc, Route 11, does not have guerrillas on it. Therefore, 2 troops move from the city of Cam Ranh onto Route 11 and exit by way of Dalat into Quang Duc province. The troops then conduct the sweep operation and activate the VC guerrilla occupying the space. Next, let's look at the counterinsurgents operation for removing enemy game pieces called assault. Assaults can take place in spaces that contain insurgent game pieces, and if the ARVN faction, ARVN cubes, the US faction, US troops, and ARVN cubes. The cost is 3 resources per space selected for ARVN cubes. US troops may conduct assaults for free, and add an ARVN assault for 3 additional resources. Assaults remove enemy game pieces based on the number of friendly cubes in the space and the type of space the assault is conducted in. I've created this chart to give you an idea of the ratios. For example, in a lowland province, for every US troop conducting an assault there, remove 1 enemy game piece. Assaults that take place in spaces with a US base are more effective, often removing 2 enemy game pieces. Removing enemy game pieces follows a priority sequence. First, remove troops, next, active guerrillas, not underground guerrillas, and if there are no underground guerrillas, then bases. If there are still underground guerrillas, then they must be revealed and removed before going after a base. Also, if the base has a tunnel, then stop the assault and roll a 6-sided die. On a die result of 1 through 3, the search for the base fails. The player will need to conduct another assault to try to find the base again. On a die result of 4 through 6, the base is found and the tunnel marker is removed. The base itself can be removed on the next assault. Now, for the US faction's assault, they may, in one of the spaces, pay 3 resources to add an ARVN assault to their operation. Otherwise, the assault operation does not cost the US resources. A final note, for each base remove, including by way of follow-up to a US assault, below or with the advised special activity, add +6 to their aid. Insurgent attack operations remove enemy game pieces. An attack can be conducted in any space where the executing faction and enemy force have game pieces. The cost to attack is 1 resource per space. The NVA can conduct attacks with troops or guerrillas. Troops may attack in any space. For every 2 troops in a space, they may remove 1 enemy game piece. When NVA and VC attack with guerrillas, it's a different process. In Step 1, activate all guerrillas conducting the attack. The hexagonal pieces are flipped over to show their star end. Essentially, when guerrillas attack, they reveal their position. Next, count the number of active guerrillas in the space and roll a 6-sided die. If the die result is less than or equal to the number of activated guerrillas, they may then remove up to 2 enemy game pieces. Otherwise, the attack fails. The removal process for attacks is different than the one with the counterinsurgent assault operation. Removed game pieces here may belong to different counterinsurgent factions. First, remove troops and special forces. For counterinsurgent forces, it doesn't matter if they are underground or not. The attacker gets to choose which of these pieces to remove. Then, once all of these game pieces from both counterinsurgent factions are removed from a space, then attackers can finally target the bases to be removed. When removing US pieces from an attack, place them in the casualties box. ARVN pieces can be returned to their available box. Insurgent attacks are not without risk. There will be casualties. Remove 1 attacking insurgent game piece for each enemy troop and base removed. Insurgent factions may conduct terror operations in city and province spaces or sabotage lines of communication spaces. Terror markers in a space hinder future efforts to influence the population to support the Republic. Sabotage markers on a line of communication block the ARVN faction from collecting resource earnings. To conduct a terror operation requires either NVA troops or underground guerrillas in the space where it is to be conducted. A province or city space costs 1 resource to conduct a terror operation. It costs 0 resources to sabotage a line of communication. For the procedure, activate one of the executing faction's underground guerrillas in each selected space. If the space is a province or city without a terror marker, place a terror marker. If the terror operation is being conducted by the VC, shift 1 level towards active opposition. If conducted by the NVA, shift any support 1 level towards neutral. If the space is a line of communication without a sabotage marker, then place a sabotage marker. As we saw earlier in this episode, the counterinsurgent factions may remove terror markers with the PACIFY function of the train operation at a cost of 3 resources each. Counterinsurgent factions will be able to remove up to 4 terror markers and restore some support during the pacification step of the coup phase. Also, when insurgent factions conduct their agitation step of the coup phase, this may also remove terror markers. Any remaining terror markers will then be removed in the reset step of the coup phase. As for sabotage, once a line of communication has been sabotaged, the counterinsurgent factions suffer the loss in econ resources for that line until the reset step of the coup phase. Now obviously, there's a lot going on in the coup phase, which we will get to in its own dedicated episode of this breakdown series. And now that we've covered all the operations, this is a good place to stop for this episode. In the next episode of this series, we will cover special activities. To receive notifications when this episode becomes available, subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon for notifications. If you found this video helpful, please give me a like and share with your friends. To be the first notified when the next episode of Harsh Rules becomes available, please hit the bell icon for notifications. And as always, this has been Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.